Let us begin the chant of offering. Stray from the path.
Welcome back to Marvelous Videos. I'm Rylan, and this is Idea of Evil, Origins, the ungodly god, born of man, that controls everything and everyone in Berserk. Explored. In this world, is the destiny of mankind controlled by some transcendental entity or law? Is it like the hand of God hovering above? At least, is it true that man has no control, even over his own will? This is a quote that greets us at the beginning of the first chapter of Berserk, and every episode of its 1997 anime adaptation. And more often than not, it holds true for every living thing. The concept of cause and effect lies at the heart of Berserk. As one sows, so one reaps. And that idea is at the heart of all things that take place in Kentaro Miura's world. Fate is as real as the threads that make up the clothes on a man's back, and the one spinning those threads is this guy, or rather this thing. Because the idea of evil probably doesn't have a gender, and probably doesn't even exist if you read through some of Miura's interviews about it. The only time we actually see it interact with someone is in the infamous Lost chapter of Berserk, and so the only evidence of this idea's existence is one panel at the end of chapter 82, with a few hints dropped by the major characters here and there. So today, we're going to talk all about that in today's video. This is the Idea of Evil's Origins Explored. But before we get into our explanation, we do have one very small request. If you like our content, then please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is just one small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thanks! Now, let's begin. It is introduced as the governing entity behind every being's fate, the laws of fate in the Black Swordsman arc. We're gonna go ahead and commit canon hearsay and assume that the idea of evil has always existed, at least as a concept in Berserk, because it technically made its debut in the prequel chapter titled Guardians Angels of Desire Part 5. Miura probably didn't know what was going to be because he only called it fate in that first appearance. As the Count's blood, despair and desire flowed into his behelit. It cleaved open space itself and summoned the God Hand. The 5 angels of demonkind inform him that they have arrived at the inner space to fulfill the heart's desire of he who has been ordained by the laws of fate. This phrase is repeated often in the Black Swordsman arc. But given that it happens during Griffith's eclipse, you can see how the idea of evil was still in its nascent stages over here. The idea of being ordained by fate is repeated multiple times in the entire encounter between Guts, the Count, and the God Hand, as a benchmark for who can become a demon and who cannot. The Guardian's Angel of Desire reject the Count's pleas to use Guts as a sacrifice, because, well, one, he wasn't exactly the kind of sacrifice that would satisfy the reincarnation criteria, and 2, well, he already was kind of branded for a sacrifice for another. The laws of fate not only chose who possesses the capacity for great cruelty and evil, but it's that person's mixed emotions of deep despair and desire that cause fate to kick in at a certain point in their lives. There are those who can harbor great malice in their hearts, but not be destined to become demonic apostles like Guts. Slan has expressed an interest in having him join the ranks of demonkind on multiple occasions, but as Conrad points out in the Count's second reincarnation ceremony, Guts was not ordained by the laws of fate, and so he could never become an apostle. Of course, later on it is established that he might be able to do so after all, but since that is a discussion for later in this video, we'll leave it at that. One of the main things we learn about the so-called laws of fate in the Black Swordsman arc is that it isn't as absolute as even the God Hand made it out to be. When the Archangel of Demonkind, Void, performs the Invocation of Doom, he calls out to the Count to make a sacrifice, and quickly. His kinsman Fento shows the Count his fate, even if he refuses. As being reincarnated once already, Slugterra's worst nightmare was already abyss-bound. The rest of the God Hand then gets to work on manipulating him into going through with it, and he almost dies, until he notices his daughter. When the Count sees a terrified Teresia in his own misty eyes, he is reminded of his human love for his daughter, and his heart changes. This causes the fiery brand of sacrifice, which was floating right beside Teresia's face, to disappear, and Void proclaims that the thread of fate has been severed. As the Count's soul is dragged into the abyss that is Berserk's version of hell, the God Hand departs wordlessly. But their silence speaks volumes in terms of significance for what this means to the story. The Count was on the verge of falling prey to the plan that fate had laid out for him, and sacrifice his daughter just to keep on living and avoid the abyss. But when he saw her frightened visage, that part of his frozen heart, which was being kept warm by his love for her, turned into a blazing inferno. He chose to let his daughter have the life that he never got to experience. And this change of heart is what changed the plan of fate. This is important to keep in mind, because no matter how much Void raves on about the inevitability of causality, well, there's always evidence that that is not always absolute. It doesn't really feel like that when you move into the story of Berserk proper though, because 9.9 times out of 10, fate will trump tenacity. Causality is a current, and this entity is one controlling its flow. The idea of evil in Berserk's canon. As a being of incomprehensible scale and strength, only powerful magic users and the God Hand are aware of the idea's ethereal existence. If you've read Berserk, then you will know that only those who pierce through the realm of humanity and harmonize with the astral world are the ones who can perceive the flow of causality. Out of these many beings, right now we'll talk about three: Zod, Skull King, and Flora. Zod is the one who lets us know how accurate causality's strike rate is in terms of predicting one's future during his first appearance. After battling the future Black Swordsman and Falcon of Light and knocking aside both, Zod is both delighted and in despair. He was happy because this is the first time in his 300-year existence the humans had managed to push him this far, but he's also despairing because his dance moves were already in the death throes. He goes to do what any valiant warrior would, and gives them deaths by his own hands, but he stops short of doing it when he sees the crimson behelit dangling from Griffith's neck. Zod, being an apostle, instinctively understands the greater meaning behind the White Falcon's quest for a kingdom. But what's more interesting is he seems to know exactly what's going to lead him there as well. Before Zod departs for the Tudor fortress he was commissioned to defend, he leaves Guts with a prediction, nay, a prophecy. If he were someone that Griffith could truly call a friend, then he should pay heed, because when the Falcon's ambition collapses, a never-ending death will pay a visit to all his true friends. Guts is left dumbfounded by this prophecy, and Zod doesn't even really care to elaborate either. But this is the first instance of a character that isn't a God Hand, showing some degree of perception towards the flow of causality. Notice how Zod says, "It's that kind of scheme," when he realizes he was about to strike down his literal future guardian angel. That's because he immediately deduces that Griffith will sacrifice the Band of the Falcon during the eclipse and be reborn as the prophesied fifth angel. Being an apostle, Zod's soul is directly linked to this deep part of the astral world, namely the abyss, given the fact that that's where the apostles end up after death. This is probably why he was able to perceive causality's grand plan, but being an apostle, he could only scratch the surface of this endless stream. He used his deduction to understand Griffith's fate. The next chapter, however, is evidence of the fact that you don't really need to be a demon in service of the God Hand. You just need to be in touch with the astral world. In chapter 37, after Guts departs the Band of the Falcon, the Skull Knight pays him a visit and warns him about the coming eclipse. Though it takes a full year for his proclamation to come true, it does come true when Griffith causes the sun to die for a fifth time. Skull Knight has also proved that he can at least sense the major players in the chess game of causality, and his role in the story seems to be stacking up queens on the good side. He saved Casca and Guts from the eclipse, because it wasn't their time to die, and has constantly looked out for the struggler at his highs and his lows. It is possible that the sheer experience that he has accumulated on his own 1,000-year revenge quest has made him endlessly wise to the ways of the real world, but these roads are allegedly paved with stones of causality, and so Skull Knight must only be able to make out its edges, and that too, barely. He does have a friend who can see those edges, and she is one who we wanted to talk about the most in this video, because Flora is proof that causality and destiny are not interrelated. The Witch of the Spirit Tree is the only human character, other than the great gurus of the Elfhelm, and that one fortune teller who met Rickard on his travels, that can sense causality at work. Her conversation with Shirake after Guts and his party reach her humble abode is the first canonical reference to the idea of evil that doesn't come from the God Hand, and it's interesting to note her perception. As she explains the various levels of the astral world to her heroic visitors, she tells them that in the deeper layers of that ethereal realm, there exist things like angels, demons, and gods of polytheism. But beyond that, things get murky. Maybe heaven and hell do exist, but no one dares go close to the abyss for the return rates were practically nil, and Guts immediately has a flashback to the Count's death and subsequent assimilation. When the Black Swordsman asks Flora how a behelit works, and if she'd be willing to teach him, she once again explains that it doesn't work how he thinks it does. As we noted earlier, a behelit connects a deep part of the astral world to a human being's soul. Flora explains that this fetish, which can summon the 5 angels of desire, is nothing more than a stone at most given times, but it will always find its way to the intended owner and activate at an intended time, thus triggering some sort of reincarnation ceremony or the other. Once a sacrifice was made, the behelit opened a fissure in its owner's heart and allowed evil to surge through it, turning them into an apostle or a God Hand, depending on the kind of behelit you receive. Because of its immense spiritual power and the fact that it dictates the fate of those who possess it, Flora speculates that perhaps a power even greater than a God Hand might have sent it forth into the world, because they themselves were the executor of its will. Thus, it makes sense that the closest we get to understanding the idea of evil, without going into the lost chapter, is through Void's words. As the ringleader of the circus, known as the God Hand, Void was the one making all the important proclamations and speeding things along the way, so that they could get to doing the thing that they came to do. He was the one who addressed those chosen for ascension first, and he is the only one shown to be capable of performing the invocation of doom so far. So it makes sense that he is the one who can clearly see the flow of causality and the hand behind it, despite having his eyes sewn shut by King Geyserich as a human. If you want to know more about that, then check out our video on Void's origin story. But we'll get back to his role in explaining Berserk's version of the Almighty. During Griffith's eclipse, Void fulfills his general role as the master of ceremonies of demonic rituals, but his words have a different meaning if you pay close attention to them. In chapter 75, after manifesting from the eclipsed sun itself, Void welcomes the apostles by calling them the lambs of the ungodly god born of man. Later, when Ubik is done manipulating Griffith into accepting his true self, Void adds on to his manipulation by describing the fallen falcon's fate as the cruel grace of the god born of man. He uses a vision of the castle of Griffith's dreams to solidify his intent, and says, "If it be reasoned that destiny transcend human intellect and make playthings of children, it is cause and effect that a child bear his evil and confront destiny." It is this philosophical treatise on the very concept of how the world works that convinces Griffith to make the sacrifice. As he chants the words of his heart, Void sends out the invocation of doom across the interstice, proclaiming that all the threads bundled by the laws of causality have now been woven. The promised time had arrived, as the band of the Falcon were marked F for food during the Inhumans' twisted nocturnal feast. In the hellish scene that unfolds following the sacrifice, only Guts and Casca manage to contend and survive, though saying both of these things for the female captain of the band of the Falcon is quite a stretch. Griffith, on the other hand, was balled up into a cocoon, waiting to be born again, but as his physical body remained with the interstice, his soul began sinking deeper into the astral world. As he kept plunging into the depths, Griffith felt his comrades' deaths pierce through him, but he remarked that it didn't really make him feel anything. As he went deeper and deeper, he saw a pool of shimmering light, and from it emerged dozens of behelits. When he manifested this thought in words, his observation was refuted by a voice coming from the abyss. The voice called the behelit splashes, categorizing them as droplets of ideas that have spilled over from this sea to eternity, a summon to the other world. The chapter ends with a massive, revolting, heart-like entity covered with eyes spread across 2 pages to make you aware of the gravity of this revelation. Now, here is where things get dicey, because if you were reading Young Animal in 1997, you'd have received this chapter as part of your weekly issue. But if you, like the most of us, picked up Berserk in a volumed format, then you would have noticed something odd about Volume 13. It's missing a chapter. It goes straight from Chapter 82 to Chapter 84, and throws you right back into Guts' seemingly hopeless bid to survive. And then Femto is birthed with the raven black wings that Void promised him he'd soar with, if he just chanted, "I sacrifice." This leaves what happened after Griffith sunk into the abyss and found God rather open-ended. But this is also where we commit canon hearsay and finally talk about the lost chapter, Chapter 82, in which Griffith descends into the abyss and feels his comrades' deaths pierce through it, is titled God of the Abyss Part 1. The next chapter in the Prevision continuity is God of the Abyss Part 2, and it explains a lot why Berserk gave many of its readers frequent nightmares.
To lay the stones that surround you now. Let us begin.
Griffith meets God and understands the nature of human life and causality, the idea of evil's true origins. Chapter 83 of Berserk opens with Griffith gaping at the thing in front of his eyes, and the only word he can utter in his bafflement is God. This entity looks at him with all its eyes, of which there are several, mind you, and welcomes him. Griffith once again asks if it is God, and the entity replies in the affirmative, calling itself the desired God, the idea of evil. The fallen falcon is still not able to shake off the fact that this massive lump of flesh was the god that everyone worshipped, but the idea corrected him. What he saw was only its core. It asked him to look around, and Griffith saw that the idea was at the core of the abyss itself, with a twin helix extending endlessly down its spine and the vortex of souls swirling about its heart. When Griffith asks the idea what this environment was, it replies that it was an ocean of feelings, The idea of evil explains to Griffith the concept of the collective consciousness. All humans, despite their individual lives, have a shared collective conscious, lurking deep within their souls. The idea of evil has the dark side of the ocean of feelings. This god called itself the ego of the world, equating itself to the world itself, and labels itself as the darkness that dwells within every human's hearts. The idea of evil, that is, the god of Berserk, is actually a combination of two real-world schools of thought. The first, as you might have guessed already, is Carl Jung's idea of collective unconsciousness that is shared by all mankind. Sigmund Freud believed that the unconscious mind was a highly personalized part of the human's brain functions, and thus could inherently never be shared by anyone else. Jung, however, goes the opposite way, and states that the conscious mind of a human is their own personal identity, but their unconscious self is one with the rest of their kind. The collective unconscious was a secondary set of a consciousness system that was impersonal, universal, and identical for all human beings. Jung believed that this unconscious part of our mind was inherited through generations and was exhibited time after time through certain pre-existent forms, which he called the archetypes. These archetypes usually fell on the opposing spectrum. The good archetypes, which were expressed as the ego of humanity, were likely to be the archetype of the Great Mother, the Old Wise Man, the concept of light, etc. The bad archetypes, however, were expressed as the shadow of humanity, and these included ideas like a tyrannical father, a youthful trickster, and the very idea of darkness. Or, shall we say, evil. It is very clear that the idea of evil is trying to imply that it has existed as an entity deep within the layers of mankind's subconscious mind for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and he says as much to Griffith when the fallen falcon asks that question. But what's more interesting is that the idea of evil itself is a representation of one of the oldest theories of existence and life itself, and that is Plato's theory of forms. Simply put, Plato put forth the theory that the physical world was not as real or true as the absolute and timeless realm of ideas. Okay, let's explain. Picture an apple in your mind. Okay, come on, just humor us and do it, okay? Now, there is a chance that most of you have envisioned a bright, juicy red apple that is crisp and sweet. Now, green apple enthusiasts can form a separate section in the back of the classroom. But here's the thing. Are all apples in real life going to be perfect as the one you imagined? Try going to a market and seeing if those apples even come as close to the image that you had in your mind. According to Plato, that image is what is real, because it is a timeless idea of an apple, and not exactly a real apple that can have varied appearances based on environmental factors. The real deal is just a cheap imitation of that clear vision. And so, this concept is also called the theory of ideas, because Plato, quite literally, considered ideal things to be real when he came up with it. The theory is basically what the idea of evil is in practice. The idea, which is a profound astral entity lying deep within the abyss, was created because of the collective unconscious of humanity. This creation must have needed an archetype vessel to manifest itself, and that vessel was the very idea of evil. Human beings are capable of doing such great things for the world, but they are just as capable, if not more, of committing some rather hideous atrocities. The idea of evil is something that every human society shares, despite having different definitions for it. And the god of Kintaro Miura's seminal creation is a literal platonic ideal. Evil is what lies at the heart of the abyss, and that's exactly what the idea tells Griffith. The fallen falcon gets more and more disillusioned with humanity as he realizes that mankind is what creates this god, and gave it its demonic form and abode. He goes to call it hell, but the idea finishes his sentence for him. He calls what Griffith was seeing just the surface of multiple layers of the whole of consciousness, but he also claims that Griffith knows deep down that this place is terribly human. Violence, loneliness, the abyss was filled with all sorts of negative emotions, and the idea itself was truly what defined human nature. Griffith's astral body, which had been splitting itself apart till this point, suddenly started gaining form. He realizes that these emotions are at the core of who he is, but he still wants to know more. Why did humans create such a malevolent god? The idea replied that humans desired reasons to express their suppressed emotions, reasons to exist beyond mere existence. They wanted to know why their lives were filled with so much suffering, why their death seemed so absurd in the grand scheme of things. Hence, the idea was manifested as a deific figure that churned out those very reasons that mankind desired in order to rationalize their pain, guilt, lust, or whatever else they couldn't cope with individually. The idea of evil's reason for existing was to produce and control mankind's destiny, while simultaneously obeying the will of the essence of mankind. Griffith realizes with a shock that nothing he has done so far, not even his dream, was his own. It was the idea of evil's doing, and the deity accepts the charge and explains how it happened. It manipulated bloodlines, events, and history itself to allow Griffith to have the encounters that would pave his path to this place. His arrival in the Abyss was established in the distant past, and him being there was nothing more than the fulfillment of a prediction forgotten by the mist of time. This absolutely shatters Griffith, who, for the first time in his existence, willingly asks for orders from someone else. But it is far more terrifying than that person only asks him to do as he wills. The idea of evil tells Griffith that it is part of him, and he is part of the collective unconscious itself, which makes his desires the idea's desires as well. It was foreseen that Griffith's actions will prove to be suitable for his kind as a whole, but doesn't know yet whether that will lead to salvation or damnation. The idea reiterates that its sole desire was to have Griffith follow its maxim of do what thou wilt, and being reaffirmed in all his decisions, the fallen falcon's first demand as a demon is to ask for wings. This is the only time that the idea of evil appears in a story, or is even named. But this one appearance explains a lot about why Berserk is the way it is. 1,000 years before the current timeline, the planet was in a global interstice, where the three planes of existence coincided with one another, and magic was far more common. This means that the world used to be far more wondrous back then. It also means that it was more susceptible to great magical calamities, and we think that is what caused the birth of the idea of evil. If you guys could just cast your mind back to chapter 53 of Berserk, the skeletons we saw lying at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth all had the brand of sacrifice on their foreheads, which is rare because each other branding we've seen has been done on a seemingly random body part. Also in chapter 362, when Guts sees the Skull Knight's last memory as a human, he notices that the God Hand is completely different, and the Abyss is actually swirling within the physical world itself. We would like to think that it was Void's eclipse that caused the birth of the idea of evil, and that those forehead-branded folks were sacrifices to bring it to life. But the truth is that it will always remain headcanon until Studio Gaga decides to add chapter 83 back to the original reading order. Until then, we're just gonna all have to content ourselves with the fact that at least we know Void's preaching about causality has some backing to it. The idea of evil is what comes up with the cause and effect of Berserk's universe, and the God Hand are the executors of its will. Currently, the series is on hiatus, so we don't exactly know what happens after Griffith has brought Casca to Falconia, but we can't imagine that it'll be anything good. Knowing that he is a servant to the idea of evil, Griffith will probably just give her over to the war demons as sport, but we'll believe that when we see it. Until then, we're just all going to have to pretend that we don't know that the massive eye-riddled heart at the end of chapter 82 of Berserk actually controls all our fates. Marvelous verdict. This concludes our video today. The idea of evil is a very metaphysical choice for a final boss, but if anyone could make it work, it was Kentaro Miura. He just had a way of blending the heinous with the beautiful, making you question your own morality at every turn. And if that isn't evil, well, we don't know what is. What started out as the generic idea of fate turned into one of the most powerful and disturbing entities to ever exist in Berserk, and that is why you guys need to stop sleeping on it. The idea of evil is crucial to understanding the deeper meaning behind the story of Berserk, despite being sort of a deus ex machina moment in its decades-long tale. But if we're to be honest with you guys, we don't mind that one bit, because knowing is learning, and if you don't learn how to survive in a Kentaro Miura story, then you're pretty much doomed from the very beginning. Thank you guys so much for watching our video here today, and if you enjoyed our content, don't forget to leave us a like, and subscribe to never miss out on any of our videos. Until next time, I'm Rylan. Have a good one, and be safe.